The drive to Sequoia Ridge National Park took me 7 hours through increasingly empty roads, past gas stations that looked abandoned, and towns that existed only as highway signs. My Honda's air conditioning had given up somewhere around Bakersfield, and by the time I reached the park's entrance, my shirt was stuck to my back with sweat and exhaustion. I'd volunteered for this assignment specifically because it promised isolation, a month-long research position cataloging trail conditions and wildlife patterns in one of the park's most remote sectors. The job description had mentioned minimal human contact and self-sufficient living conditions. Perfect. After 18 months of managing a team that never stopped talking, mediating conflicts that never stayed resolved, and attending meetings about meetings, I needed silence like other people needed oxygen. The park headquarters was a low building of weathered logs and green metal roofing tucked into a grove of towering pines. Inside, the air was blessedly cool and smelled of coffee and pine cleaner. A woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail looked up from behind a desk covered in maps and radio equipment. "You must be David Chen," she said, extending a calloused hand. "I'm Sarah, the district supervisor. Sorry we couldn't meet earlier, but we've been dealing with a bear situation up on the North Ridge." "No problem," I said, shaking her hand. "I'm just grateful for the opportunity." She nodded and reached into a desk drawer, pulling out a single brass key attached to a wooden tag. "Cabin 47, about 12 miles up the access road. You'll see the turnoff marked. Should have everything you need: propane stove, wood stove, basic supplies. There's a hand pump for water about 50 yards behind the cabin." I took the key, feeling its weight: freedom, space, silence. "Sounds perfect." Sarah hesitated, glancing at a clipboard on her desk. "Oh, there is one thing I should mention. Budget cuts this year meant we had to double up on some of the remote postings. You'll be sharing the cabin." The words hit me like cold water. Sharing? Just one other researcher. He arrived yesterday. Name's Marcus Webb. He's doing soil composition surveys for the Forestry Service. She looked at my expression and shrugged apologetically. "I know it's not ideal, but it's just for the month, and the cabin's got 2 beds. You'll hardly notice each other." I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain that the whole point of coming here was to be alone, to reset, to find some version of myself that wasn't constantly managing other people's needs and expectations. But I was too tired to fight, and the thought of driving 7 hours back to the city made my bones ache. "Okay," I said, "I can make it work." The access road to Cabin 47 was barely more than 2 tire tracks carved through dense forest. My Honda scraped bottom twice on rocks I couldn't see until it was too late. Pine branches dragged against the windows with sounds like fingernails on glass. After 20 minutes of crawling along at 15 miles per hour, I began to wonder if I'd missed a turn, but then the trees opened into a small clearing, and there it was. The cabin was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 20 feet by 30, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that sagged slightly on one side. A newer addition had been built onto the back, probably the second bedroom Sarah had mentioned. Solar panels gleamed on the metal roof, and a generator hummed quietly somewhere behind the building. A mud-splattered Jeep Cherokee was parked beside the cabin, and I could see movement through the windows. My stomach tightened. After 7 hours of driving, I'd almost convinced myself that maybe my cabin mate wouldn't actually be there, that he'd be off in the field somewhere for days at a time. I parked next to the Jeep and sat for a moment, gathering energy for the social interaction ahead. First impressions, small talk, the awkward negotiation of shared space with a stranger, all the things I'd come here to avoid. The cabin door opened as I was pulling my duffel bag from the trunk. A man stepped onto the porch, tall, probably 6'2" or 6'3", with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it and several days' worth of stubble. He wore faded jeans and a forest green Henley with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. His boots were caked with dried mud. Our eyes met across the small clearing. He nodded once, a brief acknowledgement that somehow managed to convey both greeting and dismissal. No smile, no wave, no, "You must be David. I'm Marcus. Great to meet you." Just that single nod, and then he turned and went back inside. Perfect, I thought. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. The cabin's interior was dim and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. Pine logs made up the walls, chinked with what looked like relatively fresh mortar. A small kitchen occupied one corner, propane stove, mini fridge, sink with a pump handle instead of a faucet. A wood stove dominated the center of the main room, with two mismatched armchairs arranged in front of it. Shelves lined the walls, filled with field guides, maps, and the kind of practical books you find in remote places: wilderness first aid, edible plants of the Sierra Nevada, weather prediction for the backcountry. Marcus was unpacking at a small table near the kitchen, methodically removing items from a battered olive drab duffel bag and arranging them in neat piles. Notebooks, sample containers, what looked like soil testing equipment. He worked with the focused concentration of someone who preferred objects to people. "I took the room on the left," he said without looking up. His voice was lower than I'd expected, with a slight rasp that suggested either too many cigarettes or too much cold air. "Figured first come, first served." "That's fine," I said. "I'm David, by the way." "Marcus." He glanced up briefly, then back to his unpacking. "I'll mostly be out in the field during the day, early mornings back around sunset." I nodded, understanding the subtext. "We don't have to be friends. We just have to coexist." "Same here," I said. "Trail surveys. I'll try to stay out of your way." Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. "Appreciate it." My room was smaller than a college dorm, just enough space for a single bed, a small dresser, and a chair. The window looked out into dense forest where afternoon light filtered through the canopy in golden shafts. I could hear Marcus moving around in the main room, the soft sounds of someone settling into a space. I unpacked methodically, hanging my clothes in the narrow closet, arranging my research materials on the dresser. When I came back out, Marcus was gone. Through the kitchen window, I could see him behind the cabin collecting wood from a covered pile. I made myself a sandwich from the supplies I'd brought and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, watching him work. He moved with the efficient economy of someone accustomed to manual labor, lifting, stacking, carrying without wasted motion. His shoulders strained against the fabric of his shirt as he loaded an armful of split logs. When he came back inside, I was already retreating to my room with a book. He didn't comment on my sandwich or ask about my research or make any of the small talk that usually filled these kinds of moments. He just nodded again, that same brief acknowledgement, and began building a fire in the wood stove. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the forest and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Through the thin walls, I could hear Marcus moving around, the soft thud of boots being removed, the creak of bed springs, the rustle of pages turning. Then silence. I'd expected to feel anxious about sharing space with a stranger, but instead I felt something unexpected: relief. Marcus seemed to understand that sometimes the kindest thing you could offer another person was the gift of being ignored. I woke before dawn to the sound of the cabin door closing softly. Through my window, I could see a figure moving in the gray pre-dawn light. Marcus carrying what looked like a small propane stove and a coffee pot toward a picnic table on the far side of the clearing. I lay still, watching him work in the growing light. He moved quietly, respectfully, like someone who understood that morning belonged to the forest before it belonged to people. The propane stove flared to life with a small blue flame, and soon I could smell coffee brewing. By the time I dressed and made my way outside, the sun was just beginning to touch the tops of the tallest pines. Marcus was sitting at the picnic table, both hands wrapped around a metal camping mug, staring into the forest with the expression of someone seeing things the rest of us miss. On the table beside him was a second mug, steam rising from its surface. He didn't look at me as I approached, didn't offer any morning pleasantries or explanations. He just nodded toward the extra mug with the same minimal acknowledgement he'd given me the day before at tea. I picked up the coffee and sat across from him. It was strong and bitter and exactly what I needed. We sat in silence as the forest came alive around us, birds calling from the canopy, squirrels chattering in the distance, the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. "Thanks," I said finally. He nodded once, finished his coffee, and headed back into the cabin. A few minutes later, I heard the Jeep start up and drive away, leaving me alone with the forest and a lingering warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. This became our routine. Every morning, I would wake to the sound of the door closing, look out to see Marcus setting up his small ritual of coffee and solitude, and find a second mug waiting when I emerged. We never spoke during these morning sessions, just sat at opposite ends of the picnic table, drinking coffee and letting the forest wake up around us. During the day, I hiked the network of trails that branched out from the cabin, documenting erosion patterns, wildlife signs, and maintenance needs. The work was physical and repetitive in a way that felt like meditation after months of conference calls and budget meetings. My shoulders ached from carrying survey equipment, my boots got caked with mud, and my hands developed new calluses from handling GPS units and measuring tools. The forest was different from any place I'd worked before, older, wilder. The trees here were centuries old, their trunks so massive that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. Light filtered down through the canopy and cathedral shafts, and the air smelled of pine resin and rich earth and something else, something that might have been the forest breathing. I would return to the cabin in the early evening, tired and dirty and more at peace than I'd been in years. Marcus was usually there before me, his Jeep already parked and cooling, his gear cleaned and organized for the next day's work. We would cook separately, him at the stove, me at the small counter, moving around each other with the careful choreography of people who understood the value of space. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of his work. Soil samples lined up in precise rows on the kitchen table, each one labeled in careful block letters, notebooks filled with measurements and observations in the same neat handwriting, maps marked with colored pins showing sample locations. Whatever he was studying, he approached it with the methodical patience of someone who believed that truth revealed itself slowly, in small increments. One evening, as I was heating a can of soup, I noticed him standing at the window, staring out at the forest with the same focused attention he brought to his soil samples. The light was fading, painting everything in shades of gold and purple, and for a moment he looked less like a researcher and more like someone trying to memorize something he was afraid of losing. "Long day?" I asked. He turned, and I caught something in his expression, a flicker of surprise as if he'd forgotten I was there. "Yeah," he said, "but good. The soil composition changes about every quarter mile. It's interesting." It was the longest sentence I'd heard him speak since that first day, and something about it made me want to ask more questions. What kind of changes? What did they mean? How long had he been doing this kind of work? But he'd already turned back to the window, and the moment had passed. We ate our separate dinners in comfortable silence, the only sounds the occasional pop from the woofer and the distant calls of owls beginning their nightly hunt. On my 5th day in the forest, I was returning from a particularly difficult trail survey when I saw Marcus behind the cabin splitting wood. He'd stripped down to a white t-shirt despite the cold, and I could see the muscles in his back and shoulders working as he brought the axe down with precise, controlled swings. I stopped in the doorway of the cabin, ostensibly to remove my muddy boots, but really to watch him work. There was something almost hypnotic about the rhythm of it. The lift, the pause, the downward swing, the crack of wood splitting cleanly in two. His breath was visible in the cold air, small puffs of vapor that disappeared as quickly as they formed. He was methodical about it, the same way he was methodical about everything else. Each piece of wood was split into uniform sizes, stacked in neat piles according to some system I couldn't decipher. No wasted motion, no hurry, just the steady, patient work of someone who understood that winter was coming and preparation mattered more than speed. I must have been watching longer than I realized, because he suddenly stopped and looked up, the axe still in his hands. Our eyes met across the small space between the cabin and the woodpile, and for a moment neither of us moved. There was something in his expression I couldn't read, not embarrassment at being watched exactly, but a kind of awareness, as if he was seeing me see him. His hair was damp with sweat despite the cold, and there was a flush across his cheekbones that might have been from exertion or from something else entirely. I should have said something, made a joke about the cold, or offered to help, or at least acknowledged the moment somehow. Instead, I just nodded, the same minimal acknowledgement he'd taught me, and went inside. But for the rest of the evening, I was aware of him in a way I hadn't been before. The sound of his boots on the cabin floor, the way he moved around the kitchen, economical and sure. The soft rustle of pages turning as he worked on his notes by lamplight. When I went to bed that night, I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling around us and thinking about the look in his eyes when he'd caught me watching him work. The storm came on our 8th night together, rolling in from the west with a kind of sudden violence that makes you remember how small you are. I woke to the sound of rain hammering against the cabin roof and wind that seemed determined to uproot every tree in the forest. The power went out sometime around midnight, taking with it the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the soft glow of the solar battery system. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept beside my bed and made my way to the main room, where Marcus was already kneeling by the wood stove, feeding split logs into the firebox. The flames threw dancing shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel smaller and more intimate than it had during the day. Marcus had pulled one of the armchairs closer to the fire and wrapped himself in a wool blanket that made him look younger somehow, less guarded. "Generators probably flooded," he said without looking up from the fire. "Happens sometimes in these old cabins." I found a second blanket in the linen closet and settled into the other armchair. Outside, the storm raged with impressive fury, rain lashing the windows, wind howling through the trees with a sound like freight trains. But inside, the fire crackled warmly, and the cabin felt solid and safe. We sat without talking for a long time, watching the flames dance and listening to the storm. There was something primal about it. Two people, a fire, and the wild darkness pressing in from all sides. It reminded me of childhood camping trips, of stories told around campfires, of the peculiar intimacy that comes from sharing shelter when the world outside has turned hostile. "You ever done this before?" Marcus asked suddenly, his voice barely audible above the storm. I looked at him, surprised by the question. He was staring into the fire, his profile sharp in the flickering light. "What, camping in storms?" "No," he said. Living out here, away from everything." I considered the question. "Not like this. I've done plenty of field work, but always with teams, always with backup plans and satellite phones and ways to get out if things went wrong." I paused. "What about you?" "I've been coming to places like this for years," he said, "but never with anyone else here." There was something in the way he said it that made me think he wasn't just talking about work assignments, something that suggested this was a confession rather than casual conversation. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and in the brief flare of light I caught him looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, curious maybe, or something more complicated than that. "What made you want to get away?" I asked. He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was even lower than usual. "Job burnout," he said. "Bad relationship, the usual." I nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. "Same here. Well, job burnout anyway. I was managing a team that specialized in making simple problems complicated. Spent most of my time in meetings about meetings, trying to make people collaborate who fundamentally didn't want to be in the same room together." "What kind of work?" "Environmental consulting, water rights mostly. You'd think people would be reasonable about clean water, but you'd be wrong." I shifted in my chair, the blanket settling around my shoulders. "What about you? The bad relationship part, I mean, if you don't mind me asking." He stared into the fire for a long moment. 5 years with someone who wanted me to be different than I am, more social, more ambitious, more interested in the things that interested him. He shrugged. "Turns out you can only pretend to be someone else for so long before it starts eating you alive." I knew that feeling. The exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that never quite fit, like wearing clothes that were always a size too small. "How long ago?" I asked. 3 months, he said. He kept the apartment, the friends, the life we'd built together. I kept the truck and my field equipment, and a pretty serious case of not wanting to be around people for a while. The admission hung in the air between us, more intimate than anything we'd shared in our week of careful coexistence. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the forest, but inside the cabin felt warmer somehow, as if his honesty had added another log to the yurt. "I'm sorry," I said. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time since I'd arrived, his expression was completely unguarded. "Thanks," he said. "What about you? Anyone you're trying to forget out here?" I thought about Jake, my ex who'd left 6 months ago with a speech about how I was emotionally unavailable and more interested in work than relationships. He hadn't been wrong exactly, but it had still stung. "Sort of," I said. "Nothing as serious as 5 years, but yeah, someone who thought I should want different things than I do." Marcus nodded, and I had the sense that he understood more than I'd actually said. We fell back into silence, but it felt different now, less careful, more companionable. The storm began to ease sometime after 2 in the morning, the wind dropping from a howl to a whisper, the rain settling into a steady patter. The fire burned lower, and eventually we both dozed in our chairs, wrapped in blankets and lulled by the sound of water on the roof. I woke to find the fire reduced to glowing coals and Marcus still asleep in the chair across from me. In the dim light, with his face relaxed and his hair falling across his forehead, he looked younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen him. There was something almost peaceful about his expression, as if the storm had washed away whatever burdens he usually carried. I added another log to the fire and crept back to my room, but I lay awake for a long time thinking about what he'd said. Never with anyone else here. As if solitude was a practice he'd perfected, a way of protecting himself from the messy complications of human connection. But he'd made me coffee every morning, and he'd told me about his ex-boyfriend tonight, shared something real and painful when he didn't have to. Maybe solitude wasn't the only thing he was good at. The days began to blur together in the best possible way. I would wake to the sound of Marcus making coffee, join him for our silent morning ritual, then head out into the forest for 8 or 10 hours of hiking and surveying. The work was demanding but satisfying. Long days of documenting trail conditions, recording GPS coordinates, photographing erosion patterns and wildlife damage. The forest was changing as autumn settled in. The aspens scattered among the pines were turning gold, their leaves catching the light like coins. The air grew sharper, carrying the promise of winter, and frost began to appear on the cabin windows in the early mornings. Marcus and I had settled into a rhythm that felt natural and unforced. We cooked separately but often ate at the same time, sitting at opposite ends of the small kitchen table with our respective dinners and notebooks. Sometimes he would ask about my work, what I'd seen that day, which trails needed the most attention, and I would tell him about bear tracks near the North Ridge or fallen trees blocking the main hiking route. In return, he would occasionally mention his own discoveries: soil composition that suggested old landslides, pH levels that indicated underground water sources, evidence of mining activity from decades past. His work was more technical than mine, requiring equipment I didn't recognize and measurements I didn't understand, but I liked listening to him talk about it. There was something soothing about the careful precision of his observations, the way he could read stories in dirt and rocks that were invisible to the rest of us. One afternoon, I returned to the cabin to find him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a map covered in colored pins and looking more frustrated than I'd ever seen him. "Problem?" I asked, hanging my jacket on a peg by the door. He looked up, seeming to consider whether to answer. "Maybe," he said finally. "I'm finding contamination levels that don't match any of the historical data, heavy metals in concentrations that shouldn't be there." I moved closer to look at the map. The pins formed clusters in certain areas, with different colors apparently representing different types or levels of contamination. "What kind of heavy metals?" "Lead mostly, some mercury, and the pattern doesn't make sense. It's not consistent with runoff from the old mining operations, and it's not following any of the natural drainage patterns." He rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand. "Either my equipment is malfunctioning or there's something going on here that the Forest Service doesn't know about." I studied the map more carefully. The contamination clusters seemed to follow the road system rather than the natural topography, a pattern that suggested human activity rather than geological processes. Have you checked with the district office? Maybe there's recent activity that's not in the historical records. Sarah's supposed to call me back tomorrow, he said. But if there is something going on, illegal dumping, unpermitted mining, whatever, it could mean pulling in EPA investigators, shutting down sections of the park, maybe canceling research permits. Including ours, I realized. The thought of returning to the city, to my old job and my old life, made my stomach clench. Somehow, in just over a week, this place had become more than a temporary escape. It had become necessary. Is there anything I can do to help? I asked. He looked surprised by the offer. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, I said. But I've got GPS equipment, and I know these trails better than anyone right now. If you need additional sampling sites, or if you want to check areas that are hard to access, I can help. He stared at me for a moment, and I had the sense that he was weighing something more complex than whether to accept technical assistance. Okay, he said finally. Yeah, that would be helpful. We spent the evening planning routes and sample sites, our heads bent over maps and topographical charts. Marcus explained what he was looking for, showed me how to use his pH testing kit, taught me to recognize the visual signs of soil contamination. It was the longest conversation we'd had since the night of the storm, but it felt natural rather than forced, two people working toward a common goal. When we finally packed up the maps and headed to bed, Marcus paused at the doorway to his room. Thanks, he said, for offering to help. You didn't have to do that. I know, I said, but I want to. He nodded, and there was something in his expression that looked almost like relief, as if accepting help was something he'd forgotten how to do. We began working together the next morning, hiking to remote sample sites that would have taken Marcus days to reach on his own. I carried extra equipment and helped him navigate to coordinates that were off the established trail system, using my growing knowledge of the forest's hidden routes and game trails. It was different from working alone, more complicated but also more interesting. Marcus was methodical and patient, explaining each step of his process as he collected samples and recorded measurements. He had a way of reading the landscape that reminded me of a translator working with a difficult text, finding meaning in details that seemed random to everyone else. See how the vegetation changes here? He asked, kneeling beside a creek that looked identical to a dozen others we'd crossed. The leaves are yellower, more stunted, and the soil color is different, more gray than brown. I knelt beside him trying to see what he saw. Is that bad? It's not natural, he said, filling a sample container with creek water. Something's interfering with the normal mineral absorption. Could be contamination, could be natural mineral deposits, but either way, it's worth documenting. We worked in comfortable silence, Marcus collecting samples while I recorded GPS coordinates and took photographs. The sun was warm on our backs despite the cool air, and the forest around us was alive with the sounds of birds and insects and small animals moving through the underbrush. At some point during the morning, we stopped being two people who happened to be working in the same area and became something more like a team. Marcus would point to a location and I would understand immediately what he needed. I would spot a change in vegetation or soil color and he would nod approvingly, adding it to his mental map of the forest's hidden patterns. By midday, we'd covered more ground than Marcus usually managed in a full day, and our sample bags were heavy with creek water and soil from a dozen different locations. We should head back, Marcus said, checking his watch. I want to get these samples processed while they're fresh. We hiked back to the cabin in companionable silence, both of us tired but satisfied with the morning's work. The forest seemed different somehow, more familiar, more welcoming, as if it had accepted us as temporary residents rather than tourists. That evening, as Marcus worked on sample analysis and I updated my trail surveys, I found myself glancing across the table at him more often than usual. There was something appealing about the way he worked. The careful concentration, the patient attention to detail, the small frown of focus that appeared between his eyebrows when he was calculating measurements. When he looked up and caught me watching, I expected him to look away or make some joke about being observed. Instead, he held my gaze for a moment, and I saw something in his expression that might have been curiosity. Find anything interesting? I asked, nodding toward his samples. Maybe, he said. The contamination levels are definitely elevated, but the pattern is starting to make more sense. I think there might be an old disposal site somewhere upstream, something that's not in any of the official records. Disposal site for what? Hard to say without more analysis. Could be mining waste, could be industrial chemicals, could be old military surplus. He leaned back in his chair, stretching muscles that were clearly tired from a day of hiking and sampling. Whatever it is, it's been there for decades. I watched him roll his shoulders, trying to work out the tension from carrying a heavy pack all day. Without thinking, I said, I could help with that. He looked at me with raised eyebrows. With what? The tension in your shoulders. I used to do massage therapy to pay for college. The words were out before I could think better of them, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. I mean, if you want, just as a colleague helping a colleague. After a hard day of field work, Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I was sure he was going to decline politely and retreat to his room to preserve the careful boundaries we'd established. Instead, he said, "Okay, yeah, that would be nice." I moved behind his chair, my hands hovering uncertainly over his shoulders. Through his flannel shirt, I could feel the warmth of his body and the solid muscle beneath. When I finally placed my hands on his shoulders and began to work at the knots of tension, he let out a soft sigh that made something flutter in my chest. "Better?" I asked. "Much," he said, his voice quieter than usual. I worked carefully, professionally, focusing on the tight muscles across his shoulders and the base of his neck. But I was aware, with every cell in my body, of the intimacy of the moment, the trust he was showing by letting me touch him, the way his breathing deepened as the tension began to ease, the faint scent of pine and clean sweat that rose from his skin. When I finished, he rolled his shoulders experimentally and turned to look at me. "Thank you," he said. "That was really good." We were sitting closer than usual, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes and count the freckles scattered across his cheekbones. For a moment, the air between us felt charged with possibility, as if we were balanced on the edge of something that could change everything. Then Marcus cleared his throat and turned back to his samples, and the moment passed. But something had shifted between us. Some invisible line had been crossed, and I knew that whatever happened next, we weren't just strangers sharing a cabin anymore. That was all. The contaminant had marked laying under was there was an awareness consciousness of I found myself notating where I am previously ignored. The way he always paused to listen before entering a new area of forest as if asking permission, the careful gentleness with which he handled his equipment and samples, the small smile that appeared when he discovered something unexpected in his data, and I caught him watching me sometimes when I was reading GPS coordinates or photographing trail damage or simply looking out at the forest with what I knew must be an expression of contentment. When our eyes met during these moments, neither of us looked away immediately anymore. One afternoon, we were hiking back from a particularly remote sampling site when we came across a meadow I'd never seen before. It was small and hidden, surrounded by tall pines and filled with late-season wildflowers that glowed like jewels in the slanted light. A creek ran along one edge, and the grass was soft and thick underfoot. "This isn't on any of the maps," I said, pulling out my GPS unit to check our coordinates. Marcus set down his pack and walked to the center of the meadow, turning slowly to take in the view. "Places like this exist in the spaces between the official wilderness," he said. "Too small to name, too remote to attract visitors. They're like secrets the forest keeps." I watched him standing there in the golden light, his hair slightly messed from the hike and his flannel shirt open at the throat, and felt something inside me shift and settle. He looked like he belonged here, like he was part of the landscape in a way that had nothing to do with his research work. "We should head back," I said, though neither of us moved. "Yeah," he agreed, but he sat down in the grass instead, pulling out his water bottle and taking a long drink. I joined him, settling close enough that I could smell the clean scent of his soap beneath the forest smells of pine and earth. We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the creek gurgle and the wind whisper through the trees above us. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said eventually. "Sure." "Why did you really come out here? I mean, the real reason, not the official one." I considered the question, watching a hawk circle high above the meadow. "I was disappearing," I said finally. "In my old life, I mean, becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone who spent all his time managing other people's problems and never had space to figure out what he actually wanted." Marcus nodded as if this made perfect sense. "And have you figured out what you want?" I turned to look at him, struck by how serious the question was, how much it mattered to him to know the answer. "I'm starting to," I said. Something passed between us in that moment, a recognition maybe, or an acknowledgement of something we'd both been carefully not talking about. Marcus held my gaze for a long moment, and I saw him consider and then reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. "We should really head back," he said finally. "It'll be dark soon." But as we packed up our gear and prepared to leave the hidden meadow, I caught him looking back over his shoulder as if he wanted to memorize the place where something important had almost happened. Dashed. We were assigned to the same national park cabin, and he didn't expect company. Part 2. The Space Between Words. That evening, we cooked dinner together for the first time, not just eating at the same table, but actually collaborating on a meal. Marcus had fresh trout he'd caught in one of the creeks during his morning sampling, and I contributed vegetables and rice from my supplies. We worked side by side in the small kitchen, bumping elbows and reaching around each other with the kind of casual intimacy that develops between people who are comfortable in shared space. Marcus filleted the fish with practiced efficiency while I chopped onions and bell peppers, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, the silence between us felt full rather than empty. When we reached for the same pot of water to wash our hands, our fingers brushed, just for a moment, just barely skin against skin. Neither of us pulled away immediately, neither of us said anything, but something electric passed between us in that brief contact, something that made my pulse quicken and my breath catch. Marcus's eyes met mine across the small space of the kitchen, and for a heartbeat I saw something unguarded in his expression, a question maybe, or a recognition of the same current I was feeling. Then he stepped back, drying his hands on a dish towel with movements that were almost too careful. "Fish is ready," he said, his voice rougher than usual. We ate our dinner in silence, but it was different from our usual comfortable quiet. There was an awareness crackling between us, a consciousness of every glance and gesture. When Marcus reached for the salt, I found myself watching the movement of his hand. When I got up to refill my water glass, I felt his eyes following me across the small space. After dinner, we cleaned up with the same careful choreography, moving around each other without speaking, hyper-aware of every near collision and accidental brush of contact. When it was done, Marcus retreated to his room with a quiet "good night," and I was left alone with the lingering warmth of whatever had passed between us. I lay awake for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling and replaying the moment when our hands had touched. It had lasted maybe 3 seconds, but I could still feel the calloused warmth of his fingers, still see the way his pupils had dilated slightly when our eyes met. Nothing had been said, nothing had been acknowledged, but something fundamental had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure either of us knew how to navigate whatever came next. The days that followed took on a strange, suspended quality. We continued our morning coffee ritual, continued working together in the field, continued cooking and eating and existing in the same space, but now there was an undercurrent to everything, a tension that made ordinary moments feel charged with possibility. Marcus seemed more aware of me than before. I would catch him watching when he thought I wasn't looking, or notice the way he would pause when I passed close to him in the kitchen. But he also seemed more careful, as if he was consciously maintaining the physical distance between us. I understood the impulse. Whatever was building between us felt fragile and dangerous, something that could easily be broken by moving too fast or saying the wrong thing. We were both people who had come here to escape complications, and whatever this was, it was definitely a complication. But it was also becoming harder to ignore. 3 days after the hand-touching incident, I was helping Marcus repair a section of fence that bordered one of his prime sampling areas. The fence was old and weathered, held together more by habit than structural integrity, and we'd been working for hours in the cold morning air to replace rotted posts and restring wire. I was hammering a new post into position when the head of the hammer glanced off and caught my left hand instead, driving it hard against a protruding nail that was rusty and sharp and exactly the wrong place at the wrong time. The pain was immediate and intense, shooting up my arm like electricity. Blood welled from a jagged cut across my palm, and I could see that the nail had gone deeper than I'd initially thought. "Shit," I said, dropping the hammer and pressing my right hand against the wound to slow the bleeding. Marcus was beside me instantly, his face calm but focused in the way it got when he was solving a technical problem. "Let me see," he said, and there was something in his voice that made me extend my injured hand without question. He examined the cut carefully, turning my hand this way and that to assess the damage. His touch was gentle but sure, and I found myself watching his face rather than the wound. There was a small crease between his eyebrows that appeared when he was concentrating, and his lips were pressed together in a thin line of concern. "It's deep, but not deep enough to need stitches," he said. "We need to clean it and get it bandaged." He led me back to the cabin, his hand resting lightly on my elbow in a way that was both supportive and proprietary. In the bathroom, he gathered supplies with practiced efficiency: antiseptic, gauze, medical tape, clean towels. "This is going to sting," he warned, uncapping a bottle of hydrogen peroxide. I nodded, bracing myself, but when he poured the antiseptic over the wound, the pain was sharp enough to make me gasp and clench my teeth. Marcus's free hand moved instinctively to my shoulder, steadying me, and the warmth of his palm through my shirt was almost enough to distract from the burning in my hand. He worked methodically, cleaning the wound and applying antibiotic ointment with the same careful attention he brought to his soil samples. His fingers were steady and sure, and there was something almost meditative about watching him work. "You're good at this," I said, needing to fill the silence that felt too intimate, too loaded with unspoken things. "I've had practice," he said without looking up. "Spend enough time in remote places and you learn basic field medicine." He began wrapping the gauze around my palm, his fingers brushing against my skin with each pass of the bandage. I watched his face the whole time, the concentration in his dark eyes, the way his tongue darted out briefly to wet his lips when he was focusing on a particularly tricky section of wrapping. When he finished, he held my hand for a moment longer than necessary, examining his work. His thumb brushed across my knuckles once, so briefly I might have imagined it, and then he released me and began cleaning up the medical supplies. "Thank you," I said. He nodded without meeting my eyes, already retreating into the careful distance that had become our default. But I'd felt the gentleness in his touch, seen the way his breathing had deepened when he was close to me, and I knew that whatever was happening between us was affecting him too. That night I couldn't sleep. My hand throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that made it impossible to find a comfortable position, and every time I closed my eyes I found myself replaying the scene in the bathroom, the careful attention of Marcus's touch, the way he'd steadied me when the antiseptic burned, the almost tender way he'd examined the finished bandage. Finally, around 2 in the morning, I gave up and padded barefoot to the main room. The cabin was dark and quiet, filled with the sounds of wind through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. I made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water, then decided to step outside for some fresh air. The night was clear and cold, with a canopy of stars that seemed impossibly bright after weeks in the city. I was about to go back inside when I noticed a figure sitting on the steps at the far end of the porch, Marcus, barefoot and wearing only a t-shirt and pajama pants despite the chill. He was looking up at the sky with the same focused attention he brought to everything else, as if he was trying to read some message written in the constellations. He didn't acknowledge my presence, didn't turn or speak or give any sign that he'd noticed me at all. But after a moment, he shifted slightly to one side, making room on the step beside him. I crossed the porch and settled next to him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, but not quite touching. We sat in silence, both of us looking up at the vast sweep of stars overhead. The Milky Way was visible out here, a pale river of light stretching from horizon to horizon, and I could see why ancient peoples had thought it was a path to the gods. "Couldn't sleep either?" I asked eventually. "Never could much," Marcus said. "Always been a night person, something about the quiet." I understood that. The night had a different quality from the day, more honest somehow, as if darkness stripped away the pretenses that daylight required. "Your hand okay?" he asked. "It's fine, just throbbing a little." I flexed my fingers experimentally, feeling the pull of the bandage. "Thank you again for taking care of it." He nodded, still looking up at the stars. "My dad was a paramedic," he said. "Taught me and my brother basic first aid when we were kids. Said you never knew when you'd need to help someone." It was more personal information than he'd ever volunteered before, and I found myself curious about the family he'd come from, the childhood that had shaped him into someone who could be gentle and competent in a crisis. "Sounds like a good dad," I said. "Yeah," Marcus said quietly. "He was." Was. Past tense. I wanted to ask more, but something in his tone suggested the subject was closed, at least for now. We fell back into comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. A shooting star streaked across the sky, bright and brief, and I found myself making a wish without consciously deciding to. Let this last, I thought. Whatever this is, let it not end. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked. I considered lying, giving him some safe answer about the beauty of the night sky or the peace of the forest. Instead, I found myself telling the truth. "How long it's been since I felt this comfortable with another person," I said. "How strange it is that we barely talk, but somehow that makes it easier." Marcus turned to look at me for the first time since I joined him on the steps. In the starlight, his face was all shadows and angles, but his eyes were clear and serious. "Silence isn't empty," he said. "Most people think it is, but it's not. It's full of all the things you don't have to explain or justify or perform." I knew exactly what he meant. The relief of not having to be entertaining or insightful or emotionally available on demand. The freedom of simply existing in the same space as another person, without the pressure to fill every moment with words. "Is that why you came out here?" I asked. "For the full silence?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I came here because I'd forgotten how to be alone with myself, he said. 5 years of being someone's partner, someone's plus one, someone's other half. When it ended, I realized I didn't know who I was when I wasn't being half of something else. I felt an ache of recognition in my chest, the exhaustion of constantly adapting yourself to fit someone else's expectations, the way you could lose track of your own desires in the process of fulfilling someone else's. And have you? I asked. Remembered? He looked at me again, and something in his expression made my breath catch. I'm starting to, he said. But it's complicated now. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with implication. I knew what he meant, that whatever was growing between us was changing the equation, making solitude more complex and less complete than it had been before. Yeah, I said, it is. We stayed on the porch until the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, not talking much but comfortable in each other's presence. When we finally went inside, Marcus paused at the doorway to his room. David, he said. Yeah? He looked like he wanted to say something important, something that would change the careful balance we'd established. Instead, he just said, sleep well. But the way he said it, the weight he gave to those simple words, made it sound like something else entirely. The next few days passed in a blur of routine and undercurrent. My hand healed quickly, though I found myself reluctant to remove the bandage Marcus had applied. There was something comforting about the evidence of his care, the reminder of those careful, gentle moments in the bathroom. We continued working together, but I began to notice small changes in our dynamic. Marcus would stand closer to me when we were examining maps or data. When we hiked, he would occasionally touch my elbow to get my attention, his fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Once, when we were crossing a particularly treacherous section of creek, he took my hand to help me across, and neither of us let go immediately on the other side. These moments were brief and could easily be explained as practical necessities, but they were accumulating, creating a pattern of connection that was becoming harder to ignore. One evening, as we were preparing dinner together, another collaborative effort that had become our new normal, I was chopping vegetables while Marcus prepared rice on the stove. The kitchen was small enough that we had to navigate around each other constantly, and we'd developed a wordless choreography that usually worked smoothly. But as I turned from the counter with an armload of chopped onions, Marcus stepped back from the stove at exactly the same moment, and we collided in the narrow space between the sink and the refrigerator. For a moment, we were pressed together from shoulder to hip, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body through his flannel shirt and catch the clean scent of his soap. His hands came up instinctively to steady me, and mine found his waist, and suddenly we were standing frozen in an embrace that was accidental but felt anything but casual. Marcus's eyes met mine, and I saw my own surprise and awareness reflected back at me. His pupils were dilated and his breathing had gone shallow. One of his hands had somehow found its way to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling briefly in the hair at my nape. We stood like that for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. I could feel his pulse beating fast against my palm where it rested on his chest, could see the slight parting of his lips as his breathing quickened. Then the timer on the stove went off, a shrill beeping that broke the spell, and we stepped apart with movements that were almost too quick, too careful. Rice is done, Marcus said, his voice rougher than usual. Right, I said, turning back to the vegetables with hands that weren't quite steady. I'll just finish these. We completed the meal preparation in silence that was charged with awareness and unspoken possibility. When we sat down to eat, I found myself hyper-conscious of every movement, every glance, every accidental brush of contact when we reached for the same serving dish. After dinner, Marcus disappeared into his room with a mumbled excuse about updating his research notes. I cleaned up the kitchen alone, replaying the moment of collision over and over, trying to decode the expression I'd seen in his eyes. The weather turned colder as we moved deeper into our third week at the cabin. Frost appeared on the windows in elaborate patterns each morning, and the aspens had dropped most of their golden leaves, leaving the forest looking stark and beautiful in the way that winter landscapes do. Marcus's research was nearing completion. He'd mapped the contamination patterns, identified the likely source, and prepared a preliminary report for the Forest Service. My own trail surveys were also winding down. I documented every major route in our sector and filed reports on maintenance priorities and wildlife impacts. Neither of us talked about what would happen when the assignments ended, when we'd have to pack up our gear and return to whatever lives we'd left behind. But the approaching deadline hung over everything, adding urgency to moments that had previously felt suspended in time. One afternoon, I returned to the cabin earlier than usual to find Marcus sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen with an expression of frustrated concentration. "Everything okay?" I asked. He looked up, and I was struck by how tired he looked. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was more disheveled than usual. "I've been trying to write the conclusion to my report," he said, "but I keep getting stuck." I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. "What's the problem?" "The data is clear," he said. "There's definitely contamination, definitely from an old disposal site that's not in any official records. The Forest Service needs to know about it, needs to investigate, and probably remediate." He rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand. "But writing the report means this assignment ends, means going back." I understood the reluctance. The thought of returning to my old life, the meetings, the office politics, the constant noise and demands, made something clench in my chest. "Maybe going back won't be the same as it was before," I said. "Maybe this changed things." Marcus looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Did it change things for you?" It was the most direct question either of us had asked about what was happening between us, and I felt the weight of it settle in the space between us. "Yes," I said simply. He nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "For me too," he said, "but I don't know what that means." "Maybe it doesn't have to mean anything specific," I said. "Maybe it just means we're different than we were 3 weeks ago." "Are you?" he asked. "Different?" I considered the question, thinking about the person who had driven up that forest road 3 weeks ago. Burned out, emotionally exhausted, desperate for solitude. That person seemed like a stranger now, someone I remembered but didn't quite recognize. "I used to think silence was just the absence of noise," I said. "But it's not. It's its own thing with its own texture and weight. And sharing silence with someone, that's different from being alone." Marcus was watching me with the same focused attention he brought to his research, as if my words were data he was trying to interpret. "I spent so many years filling silence," I continued, "with work, with relationships, with anything that would keep me from having to sit with my own thoughts. But out here with you, silence doesn't feel empty. It feels full of possibility." "What kind of possibility?" he asked quietly. It was another direct question, another invitation to acknowledge what was growing between us. But instead of answering, I deflected. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe that's what makes it possible." Marcus nodded, accepting the non-answer, but something in his expression suggested he understood what I hadn't been able to say directly. That night, I woke to the sound of Marcus moving around in the main room. Through my bedroom door, I could see the glow of lamplight and hear the soft sounds of someone trying to be quiet in a small space. I found him sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and maps, working on his report by the light of a battery-powered lamp. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and I saw something vulnerable in his expression, as if I'd caught him at a moment when his usual defenses were down. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. "Figured I might as well be productive with the insomnia," he said. "Sorry if I woke you." "You didn't." I moved to the coffee pot, which was still warm from his earlier efforts. "Mind if I join you?" He gestured to the empty chair across from him, and I settled in with my coffee, content to sit in companionable silence while he worked. There was something peaceful about the scene. The small circle of lamplight in the dark cabin, the scratch of his pen against paper, the sense of shared wakeful solitude. After a while, Marcus hit in on his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." What are you most afraid of? He asked. I mean, in general, not about work or practical things, but what keeps you awake at night? It was an unexpectedly personal question, more intimate than anything we'd discussed before. I found myself considering how to answer honestly without revealing too much. Disappearing, I said finally. Not literally, but becoming so focused on meeting other people's expectations that I lose track of what I actually want. Spending so much energy being the person everyone else needs that I forget who I am underneath all that. Marcus nodded as if this made perfect sense. Is that what happened in your last relationship? Partly, I said. Jake needed me to be more social, more ambitious, more interested in the kind of life he wanted to build. And I tried to be those things because I cared about him and I wanted it to work. But eventually I realized I was performing a version of myself that felt increasingly foreign. And you resented him for it. I resented myself for it, I corrected, for not being brave enough to say what I actually wanted. Marcus was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug in slow circles on the table. What did you actually want? Another direct question. Another opportunity to acknowledge the thing we'd been carefully not talking about. This time I decided to risk honesty. Space, I said. Not just physical space, but emotional space. Room to be quiet, to think, to exist without constantly having to explain or justify or entertain. I paused. I wanted to be with someone who understood that silence could be intimate, that you could be close to someone without having to fill every moment with words. The admission hung in the air between us, loaded with implication. Marcus held my gaze steadily, and I saw something shift in his expression. That's not disappearing, he said quietly. That's just being yourself. Then why does it feel like giving up? I asked. Because you've been taught that being yourself isn't enough, he said. That you have to be more entertaining, more available, more whatever everyone else needs you to be. He leaned forward slightly. But maybe the problem isn't you. Maybe the problem is that you've been trying to be intimate with people who don't actually want intimacy. They want performance. The words hit something deep in my chest, some knot of anxiety and self-doubt that I'd been carrying for years. I felt tears prick at my eyes and looked away, embarrassed by the sudden emotional response. Hey, Marcus said softly, you don't seem broken to me. I looked back at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. That's the problem, I said. I should. After everything that's happened, after all the ways I've failed at being what people needed, I should feel broken, but I don't. I feel like I'm finally starting to make sense. Marcus reached across the table and covered my hand with his, the first deliberately intimate contact we'd shared since that moment in the kitchen. His palm was warm and calloused, and his thumb brushed across my knuckles once before settling still. Maybe that's because you are, he said. Making sense, I mean. We sat like that for a long time, his hand covering mine, both of us staring at the point of contact as if it held answers to questions we didn't know how to ask. Finally, Marcus withdrew his hand and went back to his report, but something fundamental had shifted between us. I stayed at the table until he finished working, content to exist in the same space without the need for conversation. When he finally packed up his papers and turned off the lamp, we walked to our respective bedrooms in comfortable silence. But at the doorway to his room, Marcus paused. David, he said. Yeah? Thank you for understanding about the silence. Thank you for helping me understand it, I replied. He nodded and disappeared into his room, leaving me alone with the lingering warmth of his touch and the sense that we'd crossed another invisible line in the careful geography of whatever was growing between us. Our last few days at the cabin took on a dreamlike quality, as if time had slowed down to allow us to savor each moment. We continued our routines, morning coffee on the porch, collaborative fieldwork, shared meals prepared in the small kitchen, but everything felt more precious now, weighted with the knowledge that it was ending. Marcus submitted his contamination report to the Forest Service, and I filed my final trail survey with the Park Administration. Our official work was complete, but neither of us made any moves toward packing or preparing to leave. Instead, we found excuses to extend our time. Marcus discovered a few additional sampling sites he wanted to check. I decided to do follow-up documentation on a section of trail that had been damaged by recent storms. Neither of us acknowledged that these were delay tactics, ways of postponing the moment when we'd have to return to our separate lives. On our second to last day, we hiked together to the hidden meadow we discovered earlier in our stay. It was different now. The wildflowers had faded, and the grass had turned brown with the approaching winter. But it was still beautiful in its stark way, still felt like a secret place that existed outside the ordinary world. We sat in the same spot where we'd shared that moment of almost confession weeks earlier, but this time neither of us pretended we were just taking a work break. We were there because we wanted to be there together, because the meadow had become significant in ways that had nothing to do with soil samples or trail surveys. "I keep thinking about going back," Marcus said, breaking the comfortable silence we'd fallen into, trying to figure out how to explain the last 3 weeks to people who weren't here. "What would you tell them?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "How do you explain that you learned something important about silence? That you discovered intimacy doesn't have to be loud?" I understood the difficulty, the things that had happened between us, the morning coffee rituals, the careful tending of my injured hand, the moment of collision in the kitchen would sound insignificant to anyone who hadn't experienced them. But they felt more real and meaningful than most of the dramatic relationship moments I'd accumulated in my previous life. "Maybe you don't have to explain it," I said. "Maybe some experiences are just for the people who live them." Marcus turned to look at me, and I saw something in his expression that looked like relief. "You think so?" "I know so," I said. "What happened here, it doesn't need to make sense to anyone else." We fell back into silence, but it was different now, less careful, more accepting, as if we'd given ourselves permission to let this experience remain unexplained and unanalyzed. When we hiked back to the cabin that evening, I noticed that Marcus walked closer to me than usual, occasionally brushing my arm or shoulder as we navigated the narrow trail. These contacts were brief and could have been accidental, but they felt deliberate, like a way of confirming that we were still connected even as our time together drew to a close. Our last night arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made every star visible and every sound sharp in the cold air. We ate dinner in companionable silence, both of us hyper-aware that this was the end of something significant, but neither willing to name it directly. After we cleaned up the kitchen, we found ourselves gravitating toward the porch, settling into the chairs we'd pulled outside weeks earlier for our morning coffee ritual. The night was cold enough that our breath was visible, but neither of us suggested going inside. We sat without talking for a long time, listening to the wind move through the pine trees with a sound like distant ocean waves. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called, and another answered from across the valley. The sounds felt like a conversation we weren't meant to understand, but were privileged to overhear. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "You want to say something, or should I?" he asked. The question hung in the air between us, weighted with all the things we'd been carefully not discussing for 3 weeks. I knew what he was asking, whether we were going to acknowledge what had been building between us, whether we were going to try to name it or define it or make plans around it. "Let's both not say it," I said. Marcus turned to look at me, and in the starlight I could see something that might have been relief cross his face. "Yeah?" "Yeah," I said. "Whatever this is, it doesn't need words." He nodded slowly, and I had the sense that we just made some kind of pact, an agreement to let our connection remain unnamed and undefined, to resist the urge to analyze or categorize what had grown between us in the space between silence and speech. We stayed on the porch until well past midnight, not talking but not ready to go inside and officially end our last evening together. The cold seeped through our clothes and made our fingers numb, but neither of us moved to leave. Finally, when the cold became too much to ignore, Marcus stood and stretched, his joints creaking in the frigid air. "I should probably get some sleep," he said. "Early morning tomorrow." I nodded, understanding that tomorrow would bring packing and departure preparations and all the practical details of ending our shared isolation. But he didn't move toward the door immediately. Instead, he stood beside my chair, looking out at the forest with an expression I couldn't read in the darkness. "David," he said quietly. "Yeah?" This was. He paused, searching for words. "I'm glad we didn't say it." "Me too," I said. He nodded and finally went inside, leaving me alone on the porch with the stars and the wind and the sense that something inside me had fundamentally shifted. Not because we'd confessed feelings or made promises or decided what came next, but because we'd learned that silence could be more intimate than words. That connection didn't always require explanation or definition. I stayed outside for another hour, reluctant to let the night end before finally making my way to bed. As I passed Marcus's door, I could see light seeping underneath. He was still awake, probably lying in bed thinking the same thoughts that were keeping me from sleep. But neither of us opened our doors. Neither of us tried to extend the conversation or add words to what we'd left beautifully unsaid. Instead, we let the silence hold us, one last time, in the space between what was ending and what might begin. "Dear,"